I'll never forget the sight. White folding chairs lined up neatly, a string quartet playing soft melodies, and a bride in a long flowing gown, all of it happening on my dock. My dock, the one I built with my own two hands, the one where I taught my son to fish, the one my wife calls our little piece of peace. And there she was, Karen, queen of the HOA, strutting around in a sequin dress like she owned the lake itself. She didn't ask. She didn't pay. She didn't even acknowledge me. She just threw her daughter's wedding right there as if my dock was some kind of community stage. But here's the thing about Karen, she thinks rules only apply to everyone else. That day, she crossed the line. And me, I wasn't about to just sit back and let it happen. If they wanted a wedding on my dock, they were about to sail into the most unforgettable reception of their lives. Before I dive into how it all went down, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Guests were screaming, champagne glasses tumbled into the water, and the bride's gown whipped in the wind as the entire dock drifted out into the middle of the lake. What was supposed to be the perfect wedding had turned into a floating disaster, and right there on the shore, I stood with my arms crossed watching the chaos unfold on what was, let me be clear, my dock. See, this wasn't some accident. This was Karen's masterpiece of arrogance. She'd decided my property was the ideal venue for her daughter's wedding, never mind the fact that it didn't belong to her. No permission, no payment, not even a polite knock on my door. She just claimed it like she always did with everything in our neighborhood. But this time she pushed too far. Because while Karen thought she was throwing a dream wedding, I was quietly planning her nightmare. Before I tell you how it all started, let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. If you had told me a year ago that my quiet lakeside life would turn into a battleground over a dock, I would have laughed you off my porch. I bought this house for peace, not for drama. My dock was my sanctuary, the one place I could escape HOA nonsense. I'd sit at the edge with my coffee in the mornings, let my fishing line dangle in the water, and listen to the loons call out across the lake. To me, that dock wasn't just some wooden planks. It was where my son caught his first fish, where my wife and I watched sunsets with our feet in the water, where memories stacked up like the worn knots in the boards. But if you live in a neighborhood with an HOA, you know peace never lasts long. And in ours, the storm always had one name, Karen. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the subdivision, wrapped in pearls, armed with clipboards, and addicted to power, like most folks are to coffee. If you parked your car 6 inches over the line, Karen wrote you up. If your grass dared grow higher than regulation length, Karen snapped pictures for the violation file. She thrived on control. And when she wasn't bossing us around, she was plotting new rules to squeeze a little more dignity out of people who already had precious little left. For the longest time, I managed to stay off her radar. I paid my dues, kept my yard tidy, waved politely when I had to. But then came the Whisper's neighbors, telling me they saw workers hauling lumber and crates of folding chairs down to my shoreline. At first, I thought maybe they had the wrong property. Nobody would be that brazen. Then one Saturday morning, I walked down to my dock and froze. There they were, men in neon vests, stringing up white lights, women balancing floral arrangements, and a sign that read in cursive letters, "Welcome to Melissa and Ryan's wedding," right smack in the middle of my dock. I remember standing there, coffee, still hot in my hand, wondering if I was losing my mind. That's when Karen herself strutted down, waving her arms like a general commanding troops. Her blonde hair was sprayed into place like a helmet, her heels clicking on the boards of my dock as if it were her personal runway. "Karen," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, "what exactly is going on here?" She didn't even look at me at first. Just barked orders to the workers. "Put the champagne table over there. No, not there. Finally, she glanced at me with that smirk she'd perfected over the years. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "The HOA approved the dock for community use. We're holding Melissa's wedding here next week. Isn't it gorgeous? You should be honored." "Honored?" I repeated, choking back a laugh. "This dock is on my deed. My name's on the title. This isn't community property, Karen." That's when she leaned in close, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You live in our neighborhood. What's yours is ours. Don't make a fuss, you'll only embarrass yourself." And with that, she turned her back to me, already barking at the florists to hang more garlands. Now, maybe some folks would have called a lawyer right then and there, maybe others would have tried to compromise. But me, I just stood there letting her arrogance sink into my bones. The sheer gall of it, no request, no apology, no shame. That night I told my wife about it. She shook her head and sighed. "You can't let her get away with this," she said. "She's counting on you to back down. She always does this to people, pushes until they give in." My son overhearing chimed in, "Dad, you're not seriously going to let them use our dock, are you?" I wanted to say no right away, but the truth is, part of me was stunned into silence. It felt surreal. Who takes over someone's private dock for a wedding? Who assumes they can do that without consequences? Only Karen. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized if I didn't stand up this time, I'd never get my peace back. Over the next few days, I watched as the preparations escalated. Delivery trucks pulled up, dropping off cases of wine, stacks of chairs, even a makeshift dance floor to lay across my dock. Every morning, I'd find new decorations tied to the railings, ribbons fluttering in the breeze, lanterns hanging low, and every time I'd march down there, rip them off and toss them back onto the grass. Only for Karen to replace them the very next day, smiling like a cat toying with a mouse. I tried reasoning with her again. "Karen, this is private property. You need to move your event somewhere else. Rent a venue, rent a tent, do whatever you like, but not here." She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Oh, come on. It's just one day. You've got plenty of dock left over for your little fishing trips. Don't be so selfish." Selfish. That word rattled in my chest. Because here was a woman commandeering my dock for a 100-person wedding, and I was the selfish one. By the time the week of the wedding arrived, I knew Karen had no intention of stopping. The dock was fully decorated. Invitations had gone out. Guests were flying in from other states. She had committed so deeply to her theft of my dock that backing down would have embarrassed her. And Karen, she doesn't do embarrassment. She does dominance. So I made a decision. If she was going to treat my dock like her stage, then I was going to be the one to decide when the curtain closed. I didn't tell my wife the details, just that I had a plan. She gave me that look wives give when they know trouble's coming, but also know their husbands aren't about to be talked out of it. "Just don't hurt anyone," she said quietly. I promised her I wouldn't. I wasn't out for blood. I was out for justice, or at least for a little poetic payback. Because when Karen threw her daughter's wedding on my dock, she thought she was untouchable. She thought the rules she worshipped so much didn't apply to her. And that's when I realized the only way to beat someone like Karen is to let them drift out on their own arrogance. The morning of the wedding was supposed to be like any other on the lake. Normally Saturdays were my time. I'd sit on the porch with a mug of strong coffee, watching the mist rise off the water, maybe cast a line if the bass were biting. But not that day. That day, peace was replaced with a caravan of SUVs, minivans, and luxury sedans lining up the street like some kind of parade. I leaned against the porch railing, watching as guests spilled out of their vehicles, clutching gifts wrapped in silver paper and flowered bags. They tottered down the grassy path in heels, far too impractical for lakefront terrain. Laughter, chatter, and the clinking of champagne bottles filled the air. I'd never seen so many people converge on my property at once. It felt less like a wedding and more like an invasion. From my spot on the porch, I could already hear the music drifting across the water. A string quartet tuned up on my dock, their bows scratching a few notes before bursting into some elegant classical tune. The decorations had multiplied overnight, white drapes cascading from the posts, flower arches at the entrance, and lanterns strung overhead like we were hosting a royal gala. And at the center of it all was Karen. She strutted down the dock in a glittering champagne-colored dress, barking orders at the servers, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres. Her voice carried across the lake like a megaphone. No, the dessert table goes here, and for heaven's sake, someone fix the bow on that chair. It looks sloppy." Sloppy. That word made me chuckle under my breath. The irony was rich, because what could be sloppier than stealing someone else's property for a wedding venue? I walked down toward the dock, weaving through guests, already sipping champagne. A few gave me awkward smiles, clearly assuming I was just another invited relative. But as I reached the edge of the dock, Karen's face lit up in that fake sugary grin she saved for when she wanted to humiliate me in front of others. "Oh, look who decided to join us," she announced loudly, drawing attention. "Everyone, this is the homeowner. Isn't it sweet of him to let us use his dock today?" There, it was the lie, spoken boldly as though my consent had ever been given. Guests clapped politely, raising their glasses in my direction. My jaw tightened. I leaned closer to Karen, my voice low but steady. "You know damn well I didn't agree to this." She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just kept that frozen smile plastered on her face. "Smile for the guests," she whispered back. "You wouldn't want to ruin Melissa's big day, would you?" Melissa, her daughter, appeared just then in her bridal gown. I'll admit she looked stunning. Long veil trailing behind her bouquet of white roses in hand, her face glowing with excitement. She glanced my way, but there wasn't even a flicker of recognition. To her, I wasn't the owner of the dock or the man being steamrolled. I was just another background extra in her fairy tale. The ceremony began with pomp and circumstance. The officiant took his place, the quartet swelled with music, and the guests hushed to a reverent silence. The sun shimmered on the lake, making the whole scene look like a postcard. And yet underneath the beauty, my blood boiled. Every second the words my doc echoed louder in my head. As vows were exchanged, I caught snippets of Karen's proud whispers to anyone who would listen. Yes, we managed to secure the perfect location. It really pays to be president of the HOA. She said it like she had orchestrated this magical venue through sheer brilliance, not theft. By the time the bride and groom sealed their vows with a kiss, my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. Guests erupted in applause, confetti flying into the air, and Karen basked in it all like a monarch surveying her kingdom. She had hijacked my property, my peace, my dignity, and wrapped it up as her crowning achievement. Then came the reception. Tables groaned under the weight of catered dishes, servers rushed up and down balancing trays, and a DJ replaced the quartet with booming pop music. The dock shuddered under the stomping of dancing guests, the boards creaking in protest. I couldn't help but picture the hours I'd spent, repairing those planks, sanding the railings, staining the wood. Now it was being battered and bruised under the weight of Karen's empire. At one point, a guest stumbled toward me, glass in hand. "You must be so proud," he slurred. "This dock is incredible, best wedding I've ever been to." I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, I built it myself." "Oh," he chuckled, clapping me on the back. "Then you're part of the community spirit, huh? Lending it for the big day. What a guy." I didn't bother correcting him, not yet. Through it all, Karen floated around like the conductor of a symphony, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Every laugh, every toast, every careless heel grinding into my dock only stoked the fire hotter. By the time the couple cut the cake, I was past the point of reason. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a declaration of war. As dusk fell and the lanterns glowed across the water, I slipped away quietly, unnoticed among the revelry. My plan wasn't ready yet, but the decision had been made. Karen thought she had won, thought she had humiliated me in front of the whole neighborhood, but she had no idea the curtain was about to fall and the finale would be one nobody at that wedding would ever forget. Because when you invade a man's home, when you turn his sanctuary into your playground, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. And Karen, she was about to learn the hard way. If part 3 felt like an invasion, then the hours that followed felt like an occupation. My dock wasn't just being used, it was being conquered, celebrated on, and paraded as if Karen had built it herself. I stood off to the side, half hidden by the shadows of a nearby oak, watching the chaos unfold. By early evening, the reception was in full swing. Music thumped so loud I could feel the bass vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. Guests danced wildly, heels scraping and denting the planks I had spent entire weekends sanding smooth. Empty bottles rolled across the boards. Champagne sprayed into the air, splattering against my railings. My dock, my sanctuary, was becoming a casualty of Karen's arrogance. I should have walked away. That would have been the rational choice. Call the sheriff, file a complaint, let the legal system deal with it. But as I watched the scene unfold, rationality didn't stand a chance against the raw insult. The moment that broke me came not from Karen herself, but from her need to grandstand. Toward the middle of the evening, she tapped a microphone, shushing the crowd. The DJ lowered the music, and everyone turned toward her. She stood proudly in the center of my dock, sequined dress, catching the glow of the lanterns, her arm around her daughter, the bride. "I just want to take a moment," she began, her voice ringing out across the lake, "to thank the Homeowners Association for approving this beautiful venue. Without our community, spirit, and unity, none of this would have been possible." Applause erupted. Guests cheered, raising glasses of champagne. Melissa dabbed her eyes, whispering, "Thanks, Mom." And me, my blood pressure spiked so high I thought I might black out. The HOA approved it, community, spirit, unity. This wasn't community property, it was mine. Mine. I built the damn dock with my own 2 hands, drove nails until my palms blistered, stained the wood until my back ached, and paid every cent out of my own pocket. I stepped forward, then unable to hold back any longer. My voice cut through the cheers. "Funny," I said loudly, "last I checked, the only name on this deed is mine." The music stopped. The laughter died down. Heads turned. Dozens of eyes locked on me, the intruder at my own property. Karen didn't miss a beat. She tightened her smile and spoke sweetly into the mic. "Oh, don't mind him, folks. He's just being modest. Without neighbors like him, we couldn't have had such a perfect day." Laughter trickled through the crowd. Guests clapped again, oblivious to the venom dripping from her lie. I walked closer, my boots clunking on the boards. "Don't twist this, Karen. You never asked permission. This dock is mine. This entire circus is trespassing. Gasps fluttered across the audience. The bride looked horrified. The groom shifted uncomfortably. But Karen, she simply turned to the crowd and rolled her eyes. "You see," she said mockingly, "this is what we deal with in the HOA. Some people just don't know how to share." Share. That word slammed into me like a punch. This wasn't sharing, this was theft dressed up in white ribbons and rose petals. I could see it in the guests' faces, they weren't sure what to believe. On one hand, I was the property owner staking my claim. On the other, Karen was their dazzling host spinning tales of community and generosity. The room, or rather the dock, was divided, and Karen knew how to play her audience. She leaned closer to me, lowering the mic so only I could hear. "You're making a fool of yourself. Sit down, shut up, and let the day finish. You'll only embarrass yourself more." That was the tipping point. I stared at her, really stared. For years, I'd watched her bully neighbors into submission, sending violation letters, fining them for ridiculous infractions, humiliating them at HOA meetings. Most people caved because it was easier, but me. At that moment, I realized I'd rather set the whole dock ablaze than let her win again. Instead of backing down, I stepped back and raised my voice to the guests. "Do you all know what she did? She hijacked this dock without permission. She told you it was community property. That's a lie. This is private land, and you're all standing on stolen ground." The crowd murmured uneasily. A few glanced at Karen for reassurance. She clutched the mic again, her voice dripping with honeyed poison. "Please, everyone, don't let him ruin this day. He's just bitter. Let's all remember why we're here to celebrate love." Applause rang out once more, shakier this time. Guests clearly didn't want to get in the middle. They just wanted their free food, their dancing, their Instagram photos. But I wasn't finished. My eyes swept across the dock at the expensive decorations, the wedding cake, the laughing DJ, the oblivious bride and groom, and then settled on the ropes. The thick ropes anchoring my dock to the shoreline. That's when the thought first entered my mind. If Karen wanted a wedding on my dock, maybe she could have it, just not where she expected. That night, after the ceremony wound down and the dancing picked back up, I slipped away from the crowd. My hands shook with adrenaline, not fear. I knew what I was about to do. I knew the risk. But I also knew that Karen had crossed the line so far she couldn't even see it behind her anymore. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the seed had been planted. And once that seed took root, nothing was going to stop it from growing. Standing on the shore hidden from the lantern light, I whispered to myself, "You wanted a stage, Karen. Tomorrow I'll give you one." And with that, the decision was made. The night after the wedding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fans spinning above me. My wife's breathing was steady beside me, the rhythm of someone who had made peace with the chaos. But I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every ripple of moonlight across the lake outside my window, it all hammered into me one truth. Karen had humiliated me right on my own property. And if I didn't act, she'd walk away thinking she could do it again. I kept replaying her smug voice in my head. "What's yours is ours." Those words weren't just arrogance. They were a declaration of ownership over my life, over my work, over my peace. And that's when my plan truly crystallized. I didn't need lawyers. I didn't need HOA meetings or courtrooms. I had something better. I had leverage. Quite literally. See, most docks on our lake are fixed to pilings sunk deep into the mud, anchored for eternity. But mine was floating, designed that way because I like to shift it with the seasons. Every few months, I'd adjust the ropes that tethered it to shore, giving me freedom to move it when the water rose or fell. To Karen, it looked permanent. To me, it was a chess piece, and I was about to move it in a way she'd never forget. The next morning, I rose early. The remnants of the wedding were everywhere, confetti stuck to the grass, empty bottles bobbing in the shallows, one lonely high heel abandoned near the edge. My dock was littered with crumbs of cake, deflated balloons, and muddy heel prints. It looked less like a celebration and more like a crime scene. I grabbed my tool bag and walked down to the shoreline. My hands brushed over the thick nylon ropes, frayed in spots but still strong. I tightened my grip around the knife I'd slipped into the bag. The plan was simple, almost poetic. When the time was right, those ropes would no longer hold. The dock and anyone on it would drift quietly into the lake. But I wasn't reckless. I wasn't about to cut the lines in the dead of night and send the whole thing adrift empty. That would have been petty vandalism. No, I wanted timing. I wanted spectacle. I wanted Karen to feel the exact moment when her arrogance floated away from her control. For the rest of the week, I waited. And I prepared. From the shore, I watched Karen ramp up her self-congratulations. She bragged at HOA meetings about organizing the perfect wedding venue. Neighbors who had attended praised her vision, and she ate it up like a queen, feasting on flattery. Meanwhile, the bride and groom returned from their honeymoon, posting Instagram reels of their dockside vows. The images made my blood boil. My dock, my view of the lake, all claimed with hashtags like number thanks mom and number HOA heaven. Not a single acknowledgement of the man who actually built the place. By Thursday, I had rehearsed the plan in my head a dozen times. My knife was sharp, my timing perfect. I even mapped out the wind currents, noting how the breeze pushed steadily toward the center of the lake in the evenings. If I cut the lines just as the sun set, the dock would float gracefully away like a scene from a fairy tale, except this fairy tale had a much darker punchline. Friday afternoon, the opportunity came knocking. Literally. I was sipping coffee on the porch when Karen strutted up the path, clipboard in hand. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "We'll be holding a post-wedding gathering tomorrow evening," she announced, flipping a page. "Melissa wants to show photos on a projector, sort of a little encore celebration. Don't worry, we'll be gone by midnight." I nearly choked on my drink. "You mean on my dock again?" Karen rolled her eyes like I was a child. "Don't be dramatic. You saw how beautiful it was last week. Everyone agrees it's the best spot. Think of it as a community contribution." "Contribution," I muttered. "That's one word for it." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Look, you can sulk all you want, but this is happening. Either you cooperate, or I'll have the HOA fine you for obstruction. Your choice." And with that, she turned on her heel and left heels crunching down the gravel. I stood there, gripping my coffee so tight I thought the mug might shatter. That was it. She had set the date, the time, the stage, and I would provide the finale. The next evening, just as she promised, they came. Fewer guests this time, maybe 30 at most, but still enough to crowd the dock. A projector flickered against a white sheet, showing smiling pictures of the bride and groom kissing, dancing, laughing. Karen stood off to the side, glass of wine in hand, basking in the afterglow of her triumph. I lurked in the shadows at the edge of the trees, waiting. The ropes strained against the dock, as people moved the nylon, creaking softly under the weight. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the lake. My knife felt cool and heavy in my hand. And then the moment arrived. The projector dimmed for the slideshow finale. Music swelled through the speakers. Guests raised their glasses in one last toast. That's when I slipped forward, crouched low, and in one clean motion cut through the first rope. The sound was subtle, a soft snap, a whine of tension releasing. Nobody noticed. The dock shifted slightly, just a hair rocking gently beneath their feet. A few guests laughed nervously, thinking it was just the water. I cut the second rope. The dock lurched more noticeably, this time drifting an inch away from shore. Karen frowned, glancing down, then back at her wine. She waved a dismissive hand. "It's fine. It's just the lake," she assured them. I smirked in the shadows. Not for long. The third rope gave way under my blade, and the dock surrendered completely. It floated free, untethered, carried slowly but surely by the evening breeze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The projector screen wobbled, champagne glasses toppled, and the bride squealed as the dock began its slow march into the open water. Karen dropped her glass, shattering it on the boards. "What's happening?" she shrieked, spinning in circles. I stepped out from the trees, then standing tall at the shoreline, arms folded across my chest. My voice carried across the water. "What's happening? You wanted my dock, Karen. Well, now you've got it. All of it." Panic erupted. Guests clutched at each other, some trying to jump back onto shore, others too afraid of falling into the dark water below. The DJ screamed as his speakers toppled over, sparks flying. The projector fizzled and died, plunging the scene into chaotic darkness, illuminated only by lanterns, swinging wildly in the wind. And me, I just stood there calm as the night. Because this wasn't recklessness. This was justice in motion. The sound of panic echoing across the water was sweeter than any symphony. I had waited weeks for this moment, months if you counted all the years of Karen's tyranny. And now, as the dock floated free, her carefully orchestrated encore celebration turned into a circus, drifting helplessly into the lake. At first, the movement was slow, almost gentle. The dock swayed like a raft, rocking under the weight of 30 overdressed guests clutching their wine glasses and high heels. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was just a minor mishap, something the dock guy would fix in a second. But the truth was dawning on them second by second as the shoreline slipped further away. I stood on the grass, arms crossed, watching the distance widen. "Smile for the cameras," I muttered, though nobody but the bullfrogs could hear me. Karen, of course, was the last to admit what was happening. She clutched her pearls, scanning the ropes as if they'd magically reappear and tether her kingdom back to shore. "It's fine," she shouted, her voice shrill. "Don't panic. The HOA has everything under control. The HOA. That line almost made me laugh out loud. What was she going to do? Find the wind, cite the lake for non-compliance? The breeze picked up, carrying the dock further out. Guests staggered like drunks at last call, trying to keep their balance as the boards groaned. The bride squealed, gripping her new husband's arm, her long veil whipping around her like a flag of surrender. The groom tried to calm her, but even his face had gone pale. "Somebody call 911, a guest screamed, fumbling with her phone. But another voice cut in. What are we supposed to tell them? That a wedding venue just floated away? Laughter broke out, tinged with hysteria. Because the truth was too absurd to ignore. An entire wedding party was adrift on my dock, floating like a giant lily pad into the middle of the lake. Meanwhile, Karen spun in circles, shouting orders nobody followed. "Stay calm, it's not a big deal, it's just temporary." But the cracks in her mask were showing. Her voice shook. Her eyes darted between the darkening water and the horizon, where the last colors of sunset were fading into night. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out loud enough for all of them to hear. "Enjoy the view, that's what you wanted, right? A lakeside experience." A ripple of gasps followed, and Karen snapped her head toward me. "You," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "You did this. You cut the ropes." I spread my arms innocently. "What ropes?" "Looks to me like the dock just decided it needed some space." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some guests shouted for help. Others tried to leap across the widening gap to shore. Most landed ankle-deep in the water, ruining their expensive shoes. One poor guy misjudged completely, landing with a splash that drew screams from the women clutching their gowns. He crawled out, sputtering his tuxedo, clinging to him like seaweed. But most stayed frozen, trapped by fear, clutching the rails as if that would anchor them. The bride burst into tears, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Mom, do something," she sobbed. Karen's face twisted, torn between fury and desperation. I'll fix this," she promised, though it was clear she had no idea how. She turned back to me, her voice cracking. "You'll pay for this. I'll have you arrested. You can't." "Arrested?" I cut in, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "For what? For letting my own dock do what it was built to do, float? That shut her up, if only for a moment." By now the dock had drifted a good 50 yards out. Lanterns swayed, casting eerie reflections across the rippling water. Music still blared from the DJ's dying speakers, warped and echoing across the lake like the soundtrack to some surreal dream. And then came the tipping point, literally. A group of men rushed to one side, trying to wave down a boat that wasn't there. The sudden shift sent the dock tilting dangerously, champagne bottles, sliding chairs toppling into the water. Screams pierced the night as women clutched each other, terrified of falling in. The bride's veil snagged on a nail, ripping loudly as she stumbled. Her groom yanked her back upright, but the damage was done. Her pristine image was unraveling thread by thread right in front of everyone. From shore I couldn't help but grin. "Careful now," I called. Wouldn't want the honeymoon to start with a swim. Karen's shriek carried across the water, feral and raw. "You think this is funny? You've ruined everything." "Ruined?" I shot back. "No, Karen. This is what you call natural consequences. You wanted to take what wasn't yours. Well, now you're taking it straight to the middle of the lake." Her guests turned on her then. The murmurs grew louder, sharper. "Why didn't you ask the owner?" someone demanded. "You said this was approved," another shouted. "This is trespassing, isn't it?" Karen tried to defend herself, but her excuses faltered against the obvious. She wasn't in control anymore. Her empire was literally adrift. As the dock floated farther, headlights flickered along the shore. Neighbors had gathered, watching the spectacle unfold. Some held up phones, recording the chaos. I could already imagine the headlines: HOA president's wedding disaster sets sail. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just revenge. This was exposure. Karen's mask of authority was slipping, and the whole neighborhood was there to witness it. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely minutes, the dock settled near the lake's center, bobbing gently in the moonlight. Stranded, helpless, and utterly ridiculous. I took a deep breath, savoring the scene. For once, I didn't feel like the victim of Karen's endless power plays. I felt like the man who had finally flipped the script. And though part of me wondered how far I could push it, another part relished, letting Karen stew in her floating palace of humiliation. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come with handcuffs or courtrooms. Sometimes justice drifts quietly into the night lanterns, swinging champagne spilling, and a bride crying into her ruined gown. And I had front row seats. By the time the dock drifted out to the middle of the lake, the once celebratory crowd looked more like castaways on a sinking ship. The The lanterns that had been strung so carefully for ambiance now swayed violently in the night breeze, their reflections scattering across the water like mocking laughter. Every few seconds, a champagne flute clattered to the boards or rolled into the water with a hollow plunk. I leaned against a tree on shore, taking it all in. I didn't shout anymore. I didn't need to. The scene spoke for itself. Karen had promised her daughter the most glamorous lakeside wedding reception anyone in the neighborhood had ever seen. What she delivered was a floating fiasco that had half the HOA screaming, half crying, and all of them realizing the truth: the queen had no crown. Of course, the panic had escalated. Some guests tried frantically to call 911, but the dispatcher's response was what you'd expect. So, you're at a wedding on a dock that floated away. And nobody's hurt, ma'am, that's not an emergency. That answer only made tempers flare. Why would you hold a wedding on a floating dock? One man yelled. Karen snapped back. It's not floating, it's just temporarily displaced. Her voice cracked on the last words, betraying the fear clawing at her. But the guests weren't buying it anymore. They were cold, tipsy, humiliated, and very much aware that they were trapped in the middle of a lake because of her arrogance. Fingers pointed, voices rose. You said this was approved by the HOA. You told us the owner donated the dock. This is trespassing, Karen. We're going to be on the news. Each accusation hit her like a stone. She tried deflecting, but every excuse unraveled. The more she flailed, the clearer it became that she had lied to everyone, not just me. Meanwhile, the bride's mascara was streaked down her cheeks, her once pristine veil now torn and damp. Mom, she sobbed, clutching her husband's arm. You've ruined my wedding. I told you we should have booked the country club. That line sliced through the air like a knife. Karen froze, her daughter's words echoing louder than any of mine ever had. The woman who lived for appearances, who built her entire identity around being the perfect planner, had been publicly shamed by her own child. From shore, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But any sympathy evaporated when she turned her fury back on me. She stomped to the edge of the dock, jabbing her finger toward the shoreline where I stood. You, she shrieked. You sabotaged this, you cut those ropes, you'll pay for this, I'll sue you, I'll have you arrested. I raised my voice calmly, letting the crowd hear. Arrest me, for what? Tampering with my own property. You're trespassing, Karen. You lied to everyone here. You stole my dock. And now you're watching it drift away just like your credibility. Gasps and murmurs spread across the guests. Some nodded their faces, hardening with realization. A few even shouted in agreement. He's right, you can't just take someone's dock. For the first time all evening, Karen looked small. She tried one last desperate move, whipping out her phone and calling the sheriff. I could hear her voice carrying over the water. Hello, yes, I'm the HOA president. A man has sabotaged community property. He's endangered lives. I smirked. Because I knew what she didn't. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed on the far side of the lake. A patrol boat sputtered across the water, its spotlight sweeping until it landed squarely on the drifting reception. The officer's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Attention. Is anyone injured? A chorus of embarrassed no followed. Then listen carefully, the officer continued. That dock is private property. The owner has every right to manage it. Whoever organized this event is responsible for trespassing. You'll be escorted back to shore immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's face drained of color. Guests turned to stare at her, their expressions a cocktail of rage and disbelief. The boat towed them back slowly like a parade of shame. As they neared the shore, neighbors gathered with phones out recording, chuckling, whispering. The story was already writing itself. HOA president hijacks dock, gets stranded. When they finally stepped off, soggy and humiliated, Karen avoided my eyes. Her daughter stormed past her, muttering never again. Guests peeled away quickly, heading for their cars, shaking their heads. Some even paused to clap me on the shoulder as they passed. Good on you, man, one muttered. Another said she had it coming. Karen was left standing alone, sequin dress dull under the harsh glow of headlights, mascara streaking down her face. She looked less like a queen and more like a dethroned tyrant. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply stepped forward and said loud enough for the neighborhood to hear, next time, Karen, ask before you take something that doesn't belong to you. Or better yet, don't. With that, I turned and walked back to my house. The night air felt lighter, the crickets louder. My dock was battered, but it was mine again. And Karen, she had lost more than just her grip on it. She'd lost her grip on the entire neighborhood. Because humiliation is a powerful thing. It spreads, it sticks, and in a community ruled by appearances, her empire had just crumbled in front of everyone's eyes. For the first time in years, I slept peacefully that night. The morning after the dock disaster, I walked down to the shoreline with a cup of coffee in hand. The water was calm, as if the chaos of the night before had never happened. The dock was still floating awkwardly a few yards from shore, tethered to the sheriff's tow line, waiting to be hauled back in. The lanterns were gone, the projector ruined, the flowers wilted. What remained was a battered platform, and the faint smell of champagne soaked into the boards. I stood there, sipping slowly, replaying every detail. The looks on the guests' faces, the shrieks, the scrambling, the shattering of Karen's perfect image. It was all better than any revenge I could have planned in my head. And the best part, I hadn't broken a single law. The sheriff made that crystal clear. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread faster than wildfire. Cell phone videos had already made the rounds on social media. Clips of Karen screeching mascara, streaking, standing helpless on the drifting dock, were circulating with captions like "Queen of the HOA, loses her throne," and "Wedding cruise gone wrong." Neighbors who'd once been too afraid to cross her were now laughing, openly emboldened by her very public downfall. At the grocery store later that day, two women stopped me in the aisle. We saw the video, one whispered, barely suppressing a grin. "You did what everyone else was too scared to do." The other added, "She's finished. Nobody's ever going to take her seriously again." And they were right. The following week, the HOA held an emergency meeting. I didn't plan to attend. I usually avoided them at all costs, but something told me this one was worth witnessing. So I walked into the clubhouse, head held high, and took a seat in the back. The room was packed, neighbors murmuring, some smirking, others shaking their heads. Karen sat at the front table, her posture stiff, her face pale but painted with her usual layer of forced dignity. The meeting began with formalities, but it wasn't long before the gloves came off. One neighbor stood up. "Karen, you lied to us. You told us that dock was approved for community use. You put us all in danger." Another chimed in. "My wife nearly fell into the lake because of you. If the sheriff hadn't shown up..." Karen's voice cracked as she tried to respond. It was a misunderstanding. I was only trying to create a memorable event for my daughter." The crowd erupted with bitter laughter. "Oh, it was memorable, all right," someone shouted. The HOA treasurer raised his voice over the din. "This board cannot function with a president who abuses power and lies to members. I move for a vote of no confidence." Hands shot up. More than 2/3 of the room voted to remove her. Just like that, Karen was dethroned. She sat there, trembling, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But there were none. She grabbed her purse, stood, and stormed out, her heels clacking against the tile, the sound of a reign ending in disgrace. The new acting president, a quiet, retired teacher named Mrs. Patel, cleared her throat. "From this day forward, let us remember that leadership is about service, not power. And let's also remember private property is private for a reason." The room applauded. Some even turned to clap at me. I simply nodded, satisfied. Justice had a funny way of showing up when you least expected it. Back at home, I finally hauled my dock back to shore. It creaked and groaned, scuffed from all the abuse, but it was still mine. As I hammered in fresh cleats and tied down new ropes, I thought about how much that simple stretch of wood had come to symbolize. It wasn't just a place to fish or sit at sunset. It was a line in the sand, or in the water rather, that I wasn't willing to let anyone cross. And here's the twist. A few weeks later, I got a knock on the door. It was the mailman handing me a thick envelope. Inside was a formal notice the HOA bylaws were being revised. Clause after clause had been stripped of Karen's heavy-handed language. Property rights were clarified, limits placed on board authority, penalties reduced. At the very end, there was a note signed by Mrs. Patel. "Thank you for standing up. You reminded us all what community really means." It struck me then the real drift wasn't just the dock floating into the lake. It was Karen's power, her illusion of control finally cut loose and carried away for good. I looked out over the water that evening, the sunset painting the horizon in gold. My wife joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "You did it," she said softly. "No," I corrected. "Karen did it to herself. I just let her drift." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from relief after a long, bitter battle. And as the loons called across the lake and the water lapped gently against the shore, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Real, unshakable peace. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting or even winning in court. Sometimes the best revenge is letting arrogance float away until it sinks under its own weight. And that's exactly what happened to Karen. Looking back on it all, I realized this story wasn't just about a dock or even about Karen. It was about boundaries. Not just the wooden kind tied to ropes, but the invisible kind that define our dignity, our peace, and our self-respect. For years, I let Karen push those boundaries one rule at a time, one insult at a time, until she convinced herself she owned more than she ever did. But here's the truth. People like Karen only have power when we give it to them. The moment you stand your ground, the moment you refuse to be bullied or belittled, their whole facade begins to drift away. That night on the lake, it wasn't about revenge, it was about exposure. The world saw her for who she truly was, not a leader, not a queen, but a person so blinded by control that she lost everything. And in that exposure, the neighborhood found freedom. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: never be afraid to protect what's yours, your home, your peace, your dignity. Sometimes it takes courage, sometimes it takes patience, and sometimes it takes cutting a rope and letting arrogance float out to the middle of the lake. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a Karen in your life, someone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this tale, make sure to subscribe because trust me, there are plenty more HOA nightmares where this one came from.